Picture the Eastern Mediterranean at the end of the Bronze Age as a tightly connected world held together by ships, palace economies, and fragile alliances. Copper from Cyprus, timber from the Levant, luxury goods moving between courts, and great powers like Egypt and the Hittites projecting influence along the coasts. Then, around the decades bracketing 1200 BCE, that system begins to fail. Cities burn, trade routes become dangerous, old kingdoms weaken or vanish, and whole communities start moving. Some as refugees, some as raiders, some as war bands with families in tow. Out of that storm comes what modern historians call the Sea Peoples, not a single nation but a shifting cluster of groups named in Egyptian records. And among those names, one matters for the later history of the southern Levant more than almost any other. The Peleset, widely understood as the people who become known as the Philistines. The Philistines enter our view at the sharp edge of crisis, and the story of how they plant themselves on the coastal plain of southern Canaan, what we would call southern Israel and Gaza, cannot be separated from that wider moment of collapse. In the Egyptian temple of Medinet Habu, the reign of Rameses III preserves the most famous depiction of the struggle, reliefs and inscriptions that show a major attack by land and sea and name several groups in the coalition. The message is clear. Egypt claims it faced not just raiders, but whole populations on the move, with carts, families and supplies, and it claims to have defeated them. Egyptian propaganda is never neutral reportage, but even allowing for royal exaggeration, these records reflect something real. Large-scale, violent movement around the Eastern Mediterranean, and Egypt's determination to stop it from breaking into the Nile heartland. After this clash, Egyptian texts speak of capturing and resettling some of these peoples in strongholds, and many scholars see here an important clue for what happens next on the Levantine coast. The Philistines do not simply raid and vanish, they take root. Archaeology helps fill in what royal inscriptions can't. In the early Iron Age layers of sites on the southern coastal plain, we see a distinctive package of material culture that looks strongly connected to the Aegean world. Pottery styles related to late Mycenaean traditions, changes in cooking and eating habits, and an overall shift in the look and feel of coastal towns. None of this proves a single pure Greek origin, and it doesn't require that everyone arriving was from mainland Greece. The Aegean is a wide cultural zone, and people could have come via islands, Anatolia or Cyprus, mixing with locals along the way. But taken together, the evidence strongly supports the idea that the Philistines were, in part, newcomers with Aegean-linked cultural roots, who arrived during the Sea Peoples' upheavals and then blended with the Canaanite population already living there. Over a few generations they become something new, a coastal society with its own identity, its own politics, and its own role in the power struggles of the early Iron Age. Their homeland in the southern Levant is often described through the lens of the Philistine pentapolis, the 5 principal city-states that anchor their presence: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. These are not just dots on a map. They are strategic, wealthy nodes on the coastal highway that connects Egypt to Syria and beyond, sitting on trade routes that carry grain, oil, wine, and crafted goods. Think of them less as a single unified kingdom, and more as a league of rival siblings. 5 cities sharing culture and interests, sometimes cooperating, sometimes competing, each ruled by its own local elite, each able to field fighters and bargain with larger empires when the pressure rises. Gaza stands closest to the Egyptian frontier, and later becomes a gateway between the Nile and the Levant. Ashkelon and Ashdod are coastal strongholds with access to maritime trade. Ekron grows into an important inland-leaning center, and Gath, located slightly more toward the interior, becomes famous in later tradition as a city of formidable warriors. Over time, these cities develop an economy tied both to the sea and to the agricultural richness of the coastal plain, and they are positioned in exactly the place where rising highland communities, what the biblical tradition describes as the tribes of Israel, begin to expand and consolidate. That geography matters because it makes conflict likely. The Philistines control the lowlands and key routes. The highland tribes occupy rugged terrain and seek access to fields, markets, and roads. When the biblical narratives describe cycles of clashes, they are reflecting, through a theological and literary lens, the friction between coastal city-states with stronger connections to international trade and metallurgy and highland groups that are still forming larger political structures. In those stories, the Philistines often appear as the dominant military power, and whether or not each episode preserves exact historical detail, the broad outline fits what we would expect from the archaeology and geopolitics of the time. A well-positioned coastal coalition pressuring the interior, and interior groups struggling to resist and organize. The tales of Samson situate conflict at the borderlands where Philistine and Israelite zones meet, emphasizing raids, reprisals, and the personal violence of frontier life. The narratives of Saul portray an Israelite attempt to unify under a king specifically to face the Philistine threat, implying that decentralized tribes were at a disadvantage against coordinated city-states. Then comes the most iconic confrontation of all, David and Goliath, which in the cultural memory distills an entire era into one duel. The young champion of the Highlands against the giant warrior of Gath. Its story, yes, and it has been retold for centuries because it symbolizes the underdog victory. But behind the symbolism is a plausible historical memory of a time when Philistine cities, especially Gath, were major players, and when Israel's emergence as a kingdom was bound up with competition against them. If we zoom out from individual heroes and look at the broader arc, the struggle between Philistines and Israelites is also a struggle over state formation. For Israel, the pressure from the coast may have helped drive political centralization. The move from tribal confederation toward monarchy, the rise of a court, standing forces, and more durable institutions. For the Philistines, their early advantage comes from being embedded in a network of coastal trade and crafts. Their cities show evidence of specialized production, and later texts hint at control over metalworking that could translate into battlefield power. Yet advantages shift. As Israel consolidates, historically associated with the rise of a monarchy in the 10th century BCE, whatever one makes of the exact scale of that early kingdom, the balance may tilt. Philistine cities remain important, but the region is never static. Alliances change, and new empires loom from the north and east, turning local rivalries into pieces on a much larger board. This is where the story of what happened to them begins to move away from the dramatic sea people's arrival and toward the slower grind of imperial domination. In the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, the Assyrian Empire expands into the Levant. For coastal city-states like those of Philistia, Assyrian power is both an opportunity and a threat. Pay tribute and gain a measure of protection. Resist and face punishment. Assyrian records and archaeology show repeated interventions in the region. Cities are besieged, rulers are replaced, tribute is extracted, and rebellions are crushed. Philistine polities survive in this era, but less as fully independent actors and more as vassals negotiating for space beneath an imperial shadow. Ekron in particular becomes notable for its economic life, and by this period you can see how Philistine identity is no longer just newcomers from the sea, but a deeply local coastal culture participating in the imperial economy of the Iron Age Near East. Then the great imperial transition arrives. Assyria weakens, Babylon rises, and the Levant again becomes a battleground between competing powers. In the late 7th and early 6th centuries BCE, Babylonian campaigns reshape the region. Coastal cities face destruction, deportation, and the disruption of their elites, processes that tend to erase distinct political identities over time. By the Persian period that follows, the old Philistine city-state system is gone. The population remains, the towns remain, but the Philistines as a distinct self-governing people fade into a broader mix of local Levantine communities under imperial administration. Language, religion, and customs continue to evolve through contact and intermarriage, and identities that were once sharp become porous. By the time we reach the Hellenistic and Roman eras, the name Philistine no longer functions as a living ethnic political label in the way it did in the early Iron Age. What endures is something more complicated: the memory of the Philistines in later texts and the geographic afterlife of their name. Greek writers use terms related to Palestine to describe parts of the southern Levant. And much later the region becomes known widely as Palestine, an echo of Philistia transformed by centuries of linguistic and administrative change. But the people themselves, as a distinct group with their own pentapolis and political autonomy, disappear from history not by a single catastrophic end, but by absorption. First constrained by Assyrian domination, then battered by Babylonian conquest, and finally dissolved into the imperial mosaics of the Persian and Hellenistic worlds.
If you want a final image to hold on to, it's this. The Philistines begin as part of a turbulent movement of peoples at the end of the Bronze Age. They establish powerful coastal city-states that shape the birth pangs of Israelite kingship. And they end not with a single last stand, but with the quiet historical fate that befalls many small polities caught between empires, conquered, reorganized, intermarried, renamed, and eventually remembered more as a legend and a place name than as a people who can still speak for themselves.